All right, hello everyone. Welcome back. This is the third video in our lectures for today, week 6, day 1. And we're going to finally jump into talking about inputs. And when we think about inputs, most of the interactions that your user has with your UI involve a lot of these inputs and what sort of happens from there. So I want to get into a little bit about how the HTML, CSS, JavaScript world sort of handles these events. So we're going to talk about them as both raw and translated events. And dispatch and propagation we probably won't get to in this lecture, but I definitely encourage you to look at it in the reading. But we will think about this as a state machine, and output representations we will likely get to next time as well. Okay, so two major categories of input events, and these are a pretty important distinction, the raw and the translated versions of these things. Raw events come from the state transition in the input hardware, so your mouse or your keyboard, and specific bits of your mouse and your keyboard. So the buttons being down or up are distinct events with the mouse. And so an input event from a JavaScript perspective, these are the events. And if we look in jQuery, we can sort of translate them to the specific raw events of what happened in the input. So the key down on your keyboard, when you let go of it, that's a key up. The change in position of the mouse, mouse down, mouse up, those are all raw events that we can consider and we can listen for. And one sort of aside that I wanted to kind of mention in here is that for the keyboard events, key down and key up are represented by keys being pressed on the keyboard. And so most people think of key press as a legacy now, but it's still there for you to actually use. But it gets implemented differently in different browsers. So we typically avoid it now because it's sort of ambiguous as to what's actually happening here. And so try not to use key press in any of your code. Stick with key down, key up, because those are more specific events to what's going on here. And if you're tempted to use key press, like I said, figure out which one is going to be a little bit better, because it's not quite the equivalent as like click on mouse. So just an aside, I wanted to mention it can be problematic for you, even though it's out there and technically available to use. So once those raw events come in, they can also be translated into higher level events. So we'd call this a translated event. And so for many GUI components, the raw events are really too low level, and we need more information to actually know what to do to handle these when we're listening for them. So a mouse button press and release is translated into a mouse click. So two raw events are interpreted as one translated event. And we'll talk about that. If the mouse moves, it actually would be interpreted and translated as a drag and not a click. So we'll look at that a little bit. Essentially, it's just a little state machine that kind of runs. And so again, these sort of input events, clicking, double clicking, character type, those things are all sort of represented in jQuery by these event types that we can, again, listen for in our JavaScript or jQuery script. So let's talk about this as a state machine. We'll think about the mouse. And so right now, your mouse is idle. Nothing's happening with it. And when you click, when you push the mouse button down, this mouse down raw event gets put in sort of a ready state. And this is all going to be kind of read into a queue. So this mouse down event goes into a queue and it gets time-stamped. And when the event handler examines this, it can look for two events that would happen afterwards. If the mouse down is then followed by a mouse up, right, down, up, then that's going to be interpreted and translated as a click event. If, while that mouse down happens and we're in this sort of ready state, the mouse starts to move, that now gets, and there's sort of a threshold that's added in here. So you'll see little movements will happen, and we'll kind of keep looping until we hit a threshold for how much movement's happened. Then it'll push that when it gets over the threshold and consider this now a dragging event. So we've translated mouse down plus movement into dragging. And then after a dragging event, we know to complete that drag when another mouse up happens. So the distinction between those two higher level, higher order translated events is really based on how the state machine interprets what's going on. So at a raw level, the properties of these input events include the position of the mouse, the button state, modifier keys that may be going on, so like Control, Shift, Alt, those sort of things. They all get a timestamp, which is really crucial because they get thrown into a queue, and so the timestamps are going to help the handler uh, recognize this sort of order and piece it together in this sort of state machine interpretation. Um, and then there's also information about the keyboard key, character, or other mouse button that have changed. And in jQuery especially, we distinguish between key down, key up, and key press. Like I said, key press is not a great one to use. And even though they have different names, it does sort of matter really on the timing of how things happen. So particularly key down, key up, we usually, when we actually interpret a letter input, it's on the key up that we're looking for the event handler on that. And that's how we do a lot of triggering for the key down event. Could trigger a state machine will interpret a long key down as going into a different translated event, which is going to be a repeat of that key. That's how we handle that sort of stuff. Great. So I'm going to skip this for no. Well, let's talk about this. So dispatch and propagation. Yeah, because this is pretty crucial stuff. Where so as these events, these clicks or button presses happen, like I said, they're stored in a queue with the timestamps. And this is partly just to kind of handle the processing that needs to happen here, because user input really tends to be in these bursts, right? So if you're typing something out, you'll type, 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 and be done for a few seconds. All those inputs are going to get queued, and then the event handler is going to look at them, and particularly the timestamps on them, and then translate those back into events for the UI. So what it does is having this queue saves you from the real time constraints of having to finish each event handling before the next one occurs. And if we waited on that, if we waited on event handling to complete before we can handle the next event, we'd never get anywhere. They would be so slow and bulky, nothing would happen. So we just throw everything in the queue, timestamp it, and deal with it with an event handler on the other side of all that stuff. And so the way that the queue kind of handles these things is that we keep things like button down and button up events unchanged in the queue. But we can also then change things where there's multiple events that describe a continuing state. Those are going to get coalesced. They're going to be kind of combined into one sort of simpler description of a string of events that have happened. And again, it's just kind of there to sort of assist the event handler in interpreting things. So a common one is a mouse movement. As your mouse moves across the screen like I'm doing here, that XY position is constantly changing. And so we could save each of those little XY positions all the way across and throw them all in a queue, but it's going to be harder to handle those later on for the event handler. So we'll coalesce them all into an end and beginning point, and then sometimes along the way we'll kind of put like median points in there as well. And essentially what it'll do is just kind of anchor it at a beginning state, and then oftentimes we'll just do this latest known state is where it is, which can be really helpful. But when you're doing different activities, this can be either beneficial or detrimental based on what that activity is. So in which of these instances is coalescing a mouse movement going to be a good idea? You can pause this, take a second to think about it. When you are dragging a big object across the screen, if you don't coalesce this, you're going to get this jittery sort of look, because especially a big object that takes up a lot of memory, the application isn't going to be able to repaint that object over and over and over again fast enough to keep up with your mouse as you're sort of dragging this thing. So by coalescing it, you can simplify that process and not make your machine redraw over and over and over again. So that's the first point here. But if you were sketching a free hand stroke with a mouse, right? So if you're trying to actually draw something precisely on the screen, coalescing is going to be problematic, because you actually are interested in all the sort of points in between, right? It's not just about where you ended up, which for dragging, it doesn't matter, right? Like you could zigzag all the way across the screen and then drop it here. All that really matters is you had a starting point and an end point for the drag and drop. For sketching though, let's say you're writing your name or trying to draw something out that's pretty precise, if we coalesced all those mouse movements, it's going to flatten everything out, right? So if I drew the J of my name and I coalesce it, I might end up with just this sort of straight line, or at least like just kind of 90-degree little angles of things. And so we don't always want coalescing to happen, but you need to be aware that when you are implementing some of these event handlers, they may coalesce, particularly mouse movements, and you might have to handle those events a little bit differently. I don't want to go digging too far down that rabbit hole, but it is some consideration you need to have as you're handling these input events. Okay, so let's talk about the event loop. Just to kind of recap here, during that loop, we're getting events from a queue, we're translating raw events into higher level events, and then once we've now done this, we have raw and translated events. Now we need to dispatch those events off to the listeners. So the event loop reads events from the queue and then dispatches them to the appropriate components in the view tree. Now, if you remember, this is essentially the HTML structure that we put together. So in your view tree is where you're placing these listeners that are hoping to hear about specific events. So you can listen for a click. When that click event happens, it dispatches it back to this listener to allow it to then sort of use the JavaScript logic on how to handle that event. So key event is, key as in typing on your computer. That's where we're going to be able to do things like having the keyboard focus and put those oftentimes as an input from the keyboard into a focused input box. Or you can have these mouse events, particularly what's under a mouse is a really important event. Oftentimes we'll change what the pointer looks like, or we will change the actual view of the screen, right? So your view might update the color of a button, for instance. And then also for drag and dropping kind of things as well, you can grab with a mouse using drag and drop. And what that's going to do is sort of keep all those mouse events attached to that same component. So when you grab a file to drag it over to a folder, that file representation, that keeps your mouse's, all the mouse events are going to be associated with that as you move it along the screen. So it's just different ways to sort of dispatch. But the idea is that the big takeaway here is to keep in mind that when the event loop has all these events that come from the queue, it then sort of spreads them out, and all the listeners, you essentially subscribe for these events, and the dispatching is where you actually let the listeners know that the event happened. It's kind of how it works. So let's look a little bit more into some of the drag and drop features. We'll talk about this hopefully in lab on Wednesday. But I want you just to kind of get a sense for what this looks like again as a sort of state machine walks through the code of these things, right? And so on mouse move event, what we're doing is we're adding this event listener here to see about mouse move, right? And so when that happens, here's the sort of state machine that that sort of figures this out, right? So you have this sort of idle mouse. Again, when the mouse down happens, if it's a quick mouse up, oh, I'm sorry. So if it interprets it as dragging, right? So we've translated this into a higher order event, interprets this dragging, and then when the mouse up happens, that's when we drop it. You also have other options about like an escape key, you can cancel that drop. Or you can also have some interpretations as the drag is happening. You can have some inferences about where you can't drop those things. And when you're in a can't drop state, then you can move the mouse back over to a legal target and you see these sort of things. And then if you're in the can't drop state, a mouse up or an escape is also going to cancel that drop and move it back to the same place. So we're going to dig more into this drag and drop sort of stuff into the lab next time. But I did want to give you a sense for what some of these things look like and how we handle these as events, because it's not necessarily as straightforward as you might see. And we'll do some practice with this on Wednesday to really try it out and make sure that our event listening actually aligns with the way that event handling is happened in our GUIs. So thanks so much, everybody. This is going to be the last video for the lecture today. I'm going to post the in-class assignment not as part of a video. I'm just going to post that as a file in this weekly content for today. And you'll also note that there's going to be a YouTube playlist for a CSS tutorial through W3 Schools. Highly encourage you to take a look at that, especially if you're new to CSS. But even if you know it pretty well, like I said, I actually got a little bit out of it too. So please take a look at those. Throw me some questions or concerns or anything I can help with in Piazza. And I hope you're all off to a great week. I will see you on Wednesday for lab time. And I appreciate you all being here. Thanks a lot. See you next time.